SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, we will be continuing on our module on the basics of Buddhist and Jain architecture. So far we have covered the basics of Buddhist architecture in its initial stage and how it had flourished in the Indian subcontinent. And today we will be looking into some of the basics of the Jainism, their impact on the sculpture making and architecture making in the Indian subcontinent. Now, the idea of Jainism and this religion which has been there in the Indian subcontinent and which is believed to be there at least since the 2000 BC. So, it is one of the oldest surviving religion in the Indian subcontinent. However, we also we do see that these ideas about Jainism that had also their similarities and dissimilarities with what we see in terms of Buddhism. Now, some of in terms of the Jainism, what we find the most important part is this idea of Jina or the liberated one, and that is how this entire religion came into known as Jainism. So, the Jinas or the liberated ones who are free from the cycle of birth and rebirth, and they are the ones who know the universal truth. So, for them what we find there is that how the Jinas they have been there. There were 23 of these Jinas. They are also known as the Tirthankaras. So, they have been there before the birth of Buddha. So, the last Tirthankara who was there before the birth of Buddha, that was Parshvanath in the 8th century BC, and then the one who was there who was contemporary of Buddha, and there had been accounts in which we find that there had been debates or discussion sessions in which both Buddha and this Jaina Tirthankara, the last of the Jaina Tirthankaras, were present. And so, in that particular context, we find that Jaina Tirthankara who was a contemporary of Buddha, the last Jaina Tirthankara, he was Mahavira. So, we find that the spread of Jainism, it was to some extent that the early phase of Jainism, we find that they had their prominence in the places like in Bihar, in parts of northern and central India, and we also see with time that there had been a significant presence of Jainism, and not only in north and central India, but also in the western India as well as in the southern India. Now, some of the things that we find to be really interesting features as part of the Jaina figures, for example, the one we have here on screen. And so, there is the figures, for example, the Tirthankaras that we have here. So, in that case we have certain particular features of them which are as part of their body, and that makes them distinguishable from the other Tirthankaras. So, for example, all the Jaina Tirthankaras, we find them to be either seated or in the standing posture, in the Samavanga posture, in which we find that they are standing vertically, straightforward, without leaning in any other direction or having any other gesture. So, in that case we find that they are the ones, these Jaina Tirthankaras, they are represented that way, and usually they are represented as nudes, and that is because that we find that there were three of the prime concepts which are at the core of the Jaina beliefs, and that is with non-violence, with abandonment, and with non-attachment. So we can imagine that how this abandonment of the material life, and that makes an impact on these figures, that the figures are not associated with any kind of ornaments, they are not associated with royal robes or any other different kind of textiles or anything else. They are not attached to any kind of material pleasure. That is the reason showing them to be stark nude is part of the larger concept of their ideology. Also, that the idea of non-attachment is something that is very important in the Jaina belief, that we find that this the liberated ones or the jinnas, they were not attached to the material world, as well as the they were not attached in terms of how the human relations work. So that is the reason they have been shown as this singular figure who are who stand tall, or if they are seated in a position, they are engaged in the meditative process and they are not attached to anyone else around them. So these are some of the ideas that we find, that how these overarching themes in Jainism also make their impact on the sculptures that we find from the Jaina context. Now, some of the other things, that even though these are some of the basic characteristic features of the Jaina figures we find across the subcontinent, there are also some of the things in which we can distinguish one Tirthankara from the other. And those are some of the issues that we can see here. So, for example, here we have an image of Tirthankara Rishabhanatha, and this particular figure that comes from Chaucer in Bihar, and that perhaps was made somewhere between 2nd and 1st century BC. In this one, what we find, that there are those open locks of hair that is represented on Rishabhanatha. So this locks of hair is something that is associated with Rishabhanatha and no other Tirthankaras. So when we see these open locks of hair, then we immediately understand that this is the figure of the Tirthankara Rishabhanatha. Then there is also another sign which we find here around this place, and that is considered to be the Srivatsa sign, and that is also a very important mark of their divinity in the Jaina context. So those are some of the signs or the iconographical features that are very much part of the Jaina sculptures that make us understand how the sculptures are made in the Jaina context and not in the Buddhist context or in the Hindu context. Now, from there I wanted to show another image that is there in the right side of the screen, even though this image comes from much later time, and that is perhaps from 9th to 10th century AD, but I wanted to show this image to have a sense of how these iconographical traits they work. So, for example, here we have this particular image which looks very similar to how Buddha's image is made, and we have already seen the images of Buddha who is seated in this Padmasana position or this cross-legged position in a meditative gesture, and then with sometimes with the hands in the Abhaya Mudra or in the meditative gesture, for example here the way we see it, or of course that how there are some of the other signs which also can be confused with the sign of Buddha. So, for example, how the coiled hair that we have here, and then there is a bun on the top of his head. So, these marks can also be confused with Buddha, but the thing is that when we see it is also associated with this 7-hooded snake, then we know that this is mark of Parshvanatha. So, Parshvanatha was the Jaina Tirthankara who was active in the 8th century BC, and Rishabhanatha was the one who was the first Jaina Tirthankara. So, what we have here, that even though there are some of the signs or even though there are some of the iconographical features which might seem a bit confusing with the Buddhist signs, but these small traits. So, for example, how each of these Jaina Tirthankaras will be associated with each of these signs, for example, the matted locks or this 7-hooded snake, those are the ones through which we can understand that these images are made in the Jaina context and not in the Buddhist context. Also, this Srivatsa sign that we have spoken about, that's there in their chest, that marks their divinity in the Jaina context. So, that is also something not present in the Buddhist context. Now, the Buddha's urna or this particular mark in his forehead, that is also something that we do not really see to be part of the Jainas, but sometimes there will be a mark of an eye that will be represented. Now, the other thing that we also find to be, which can be a distinguishing mark from the Buddhist sculptures, and that is that the Jaina sculptures in all these contexts, we find them to be always nude. So, in terms of Buddha, we find that he always wears the monk's robes, the robe which flows from one of his shoulder, keeping the other shoulder bare, and then like this very simple robe of a monk, which we find to be not only there in the Buddhist context, but also in the Hindu context. But in this case, in the Jaina context, we find that they are usually stark nude. Now, the other thing that we find that with time there have been the attendant figures and so on, they had been joined by the sides of the Jaina figures. However, we see that this idea of non-attachment of this Jaina figures to be prevalent in the way they are not attached to any of those material happenings or the happenings around them in the sculptures as well. So, those are some of the signs in which we can distinguish them from the Buddha sculptures or from the Hindu sculptures. So, in terms of some of the early traces of the Jaina architecture that we find, that they had also developed as rock cut architecture in many of these places, and here we have images from this site of Udayagiri in Odisha, and that developed somewhere between 5th century BC to 2nd century AD, and we know that this was a site of pilgrimage, and as we can see that there are those living rock structures. In the left side of the screen, we find that there were those rock structures already existing, which were carved, and those series of those pillars to make a colonnade or like a covered pavilion or a veranda was made. And then there were those individual cells for the monks and the nuns, those were made, and of course there were also places for the visitors or the pilgrims, those were made. And then there were also some of the sites where we find that the prayer halls where all the monks and the nuns would gather during the prayers, those were also made. So, this is something that we find that how the making of these structures that had their roots in this earlier times, perhaps something that predates Buddhism, that was also there in Jainism as well, to make use of these existing structures and then carving them out to make places of habitation for the monks and the nuns and the pilgrims. So, again these structures are made from stone, but they are not really built for the royal people, they are not really built as palaces, but they are built as monasteries, something that we have also seen in the Buddhist context. And then there are some of the details of the sculptures that we find. So, for example, here we have this Rani Gumpha or cave 1, from which we have that the images that those are featured there in this rock cut shelters or this rock cut sites, where some of the contemporary events, those are depicted. So, these particular images, they come from 2nd to 1st century BC, and there very surprisingly, even though the sites were made for Jaina pilgrimage or for the monks and the nuns, there are some of the narrative panels in the horizontal panels. We find that there are some of the scenes in which the warfare and the mighty deeds of the kings, those were also carved out. So, in a way we can understand that how religion and the spread of religion is never independent of the socio-political and cultural context during their own times. So, how the patrons of this rock cut caves and these shelters, rulers. So they have also made an impact of their own deeds and their warfare, their achievements in these sites of pilgrimage as well as practicing religion. This is another image from the site of Khandagiri. So Khandagiri and Udayagiri, these two places are neighboring sites in Odisha, and this site we find that here there is an image from cave 2, and that comes from 1st century BC. And then what we have here really interesting is that how these individual cells, as I have mentioned earlier, for the monks and the nuns to stay inside and I mean to take shelter, and as well as perhaps continue their daily activities and their education and things like that. And how these individual cells, they do not have much of decoration inside, but how the outer walls are made, that also bear some of the references to this trifoil arch motif that we have studied in the Buddhist context so far. So this particular arch motif that first we have seen in the Lomas Rishi cave in Bihar, and then we found that how that arch motif also became really significant in terms of the Buddhist art and architecture. So this is also something we find it was developing simultaneously with the Buddhist art and architecture. So one thing we can find that how the architectural motifs, those were there that were present during this time period, like the 3rd century, 2nd century BC and so on, they were not really specific to one religion, but they were there used by different groups, different communities, and both Jainism and Buddhism, they have incorporated this particular architectural motifs as part of their structures. So as we have already spoken about this trifoil arch motif and or this Chaitya archway which it came into being, and this is something that we have seen in the Lomas Rishi cave. Later on we have also seen how that was also reflected in the Karla and Bhaja caves, and here we also see them in the Jaina context in Khandagiri. And then in the panel which is there on the top of the doorways, there we find some of the images of the gods and goddesses. So for example, here from the Ananta Gumpha or cave 3 in Khandagiri, in the right side of the screen we have image of Gajalakshmi. So Gajalakshmi is a goddess who's been also revered in Hinduism and in the Hindu belief, and she is also someone who's associated with prosperity and life and fertility and so on, those in the Jaina context. So we find that, I mean, there is this figure of Gajalakshmi who's represented here in the frontal form. Only the deities or someone who's highly significant, they are represented in this kind of frontal form, as we have also seen in the figures of Buddha or the Jaina Tirthankaras. So we see that, I mean, there is the figure of Gajalakshmi who's at the center of this particular panel, and she holds the lotus stems and from which the lotuses are blooming, and there are also many other lotuses that we find around her. So it is basically, it's a stylized representation of a lake full of lotuses, and then there are two elephants by both her sides who are showering water in a way to welcome her. So that is the reason this association with the elephant or Gaja that comes into this name of Gajalakshmi. So these are some of the characteristics we find that, I mean, how there are particular figures in terms of the gods and goddesses who are relevant not only in the one religion, but in several religion, in multiple religion, as the architectural motifs like this Chaitya motif or this trifoil arch motif, which was first seen in the Lomas Rishi cave, and then of course in the Buddhist context and in the Jaina context, and perhaps this kind of developments were simultaneous. It was not really like whether the Buddhist predated the Jainas or the Jainas did it first and then the Buddhist, but perhaps these things continued simultaneously. From there we also have another site which is also highly significant, and that particular place is called Kankali Tila, and this is a site which was developed in the 2nd century BC, which is very close to the place of Mathura, and there the excavations and this name of Kankali Tila that actually came into being from this temple which was dedicated to Kankali, or the fierce manifestation of the great goddess Kali in the later times. But this was a site where this a Jaina stupa was there in the 2nd century BC or so on. So we have an image of its excavation in the 19th century that is there in the left side of the screen, and in the right side we have one of the panels which are found from this site that shows a representation of the stupa. And this panel, which is now it is kept in a museum in Mathura, that shows this, that has the Brahmi script in its lower part of it and here, and then it also shows all the architectural details of a Jaina stupa. So unlike the Buddhist stupa, in which what we found that how the Buddhist the relic of the Buddha was kept in the stupa, and that was the site of veneration that developed. In terms of the Jaina stupa, we have that how the stupa became a mark of the Mount Meru. So the Mount Meru is also considered to be the center of the entire universe, and this is something that is believed both in Jainism as well as in Hinduism. So the stupa became a sign of the Mount Meru, and that is something we find that even though there are some of those structural similarities here, the stupa structure we find, and there are some of the celestial women they are represented who sort of support this stupa structure. Also they show the importance of this particular structure, and then we also have how this is situated on a higher platform, something that we have also considered in the Buddhist context, that how if a structure is not really situated on the ground but on a higher platform, that shows its religious as well as spiritual importance. So something that we also see it here as well. And then it's not only just that, but we also find the kind of railing which surrounds the stupa that also goes very similar to what we have seen in Bharut or in Sanchi, with the horizontal bars and those vertical columns, how they sort of intersect and make this really interesting railings. Now, another characteristic feature we also see here are those elaborate gateways. That is also something we have seen in Sanchi, and here we see that how this elaborate gateways, they also follow very similar kind of programmatic that we have seen there, but they also bear some of the very significant symbols from the Jaina context that make them distinguishable from the Buddhist structures. So these are some of the exchanges we can talk about, that how certain kind of architectural motifs were there, and how those architectural motifs actually were not specific to one religion but several religions, and stupa is one of the examples of that, and the other one we have already spoken about, and that is the one we see in this trifoil arch motif. So another Jaina site, a very important one in southern India, will be the site of Shravanabelagola, and Shravanabelagola is the site which perhaps developed during the 3rd to 2nd century BC, as we know that this is also the site where the Maurya Emperor Chandragupta Maurya had relocated. So Chandragupta Maurya was grandfather of Emperor Ashoka, and after he retired from his responsibilities as a ruler, then he relocated to this southern this southern site of Shravanabelagola, which is in southern Karnataka today. So in this place what we find that there was already this hillside, and perhaps there was already some significance of the Jainas here, and with Chandragupta Maurya's arrival, the importance of this site grew further and further. So here in the left side of the screen we have images of this small rock shelters in the Chandragiri cave, and Chandragiri was, this particular hill was also named after Chandragupta Maurya. And then in the later times we find that this Shravanabelagola, this site that had developed into a much larger temple complex, and there is a temple for people to gather there and pray, but also there are monasteries, there are places for educational activities and the other ritualistic purposes. So this is how we find that, I mean, a site this of Jaina veneration that had developed during this 3rd to 2nd century BC, and that continued to be in practice in the much later times as well. And later on, much later, we find that, I mean, this mighty sculpture of Gomateshwara that was added to this complex of Shravanabelagola on this hillside. So that also that added to this the significance of this site, and also how the pilgrims interaction with this site had developed further and further with time. So from there, if I come back to some of the common characteristic features of this, what we have studied so far in this module, we can say that there have been some of the crucial features of this architecture, starting with this trifoil arch motif, also with the stupa, and how this particular forms in architecture, they are not just significant for one particular community or in one context, but they had their significance in a much larger scale. And that happened perhaps because of the power of this architectural structures as well as these forms, which transcended the religious boundaries, and their importance was revered, their importance was acknowledged by the people, not only from one religious background but from several religious backgrounds. And this is also to something that, I mean, it ran into the discussion of our of this module, but I mean, perhaps it was not been explicitly addressed, that how there have been an importance of the hillsides, site which is perhaps slightly upper from the regular ground level, and how those hillsides or something that is like a plateau or something like a stupa, which basically means like a piled up form, that become very important in terms of understanding this religious belief and philosophy. So how this particular form which had its relevance in both in Jainism as well as in Buddhism, we find that how these forms, they already had this particular form or this structure, which perhaps made the practitioners both in these religions to think about their importance in a much more in a symbolic way, or to take them in the realm of philosophy. So that is how we find that, I mean, even though that architecture and sculpture making is something that is happening with material, with our hands, with our eyes, but I mean, they always have their relationship, they have always their deeper meanings into how they relate to these religious ideologies, the philosophy and the underlying meanings. So that is how the symbols, the structures, the forms, the materials and the community lives are interwoven into the study of art and architecture in the Buddhist and Jaina context. Thank you.